So we've spent the last two sessions exploring Franz Rosenzweig's understanding of Halakha, Jewish law. And as I've mentioned, Halakha is very important to Rosenzweig. He doesn't think Judaism is possible without Halakha. Right? That's how central it is to his thinking. However, as we know, Rosenzweig's conception of Halakha is one that is neither Orthodox or Reform. 2 sessions ago, we looked at Rosenzweig's reaction to Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, the great founder of neo-Orthodoxy in Germany in the 19th century. Hirsch sees Halakha as completely binding on the modern Jew. It reflects God's will as received at Sinai, and therefore we're commanded to follow it. God commanded, we got to listen. But at the same time, Hirsch attempts to show how there are rationales and reasons for all the mitzvot. He attempts to show that they're not irrational, that they have tangible benefits for one who keeps them, and that by doing mitzvot, it has a positive effect on the world. If you remember, Rosenzweig disagrees with Hirsch on all of this. He argues that Jews never kept mitzvot simply because they were commanded, as if there's like an authority figure who the Jews just had to listen to because God is that authority figure, or because the Jews had good and logical reasons to keep the mitzvot, because they do good things for us and for the world. Rather, Jews kept mitzvot, they kept the Torah, because it's what gave their life meaning. And not that it was like meaningful in the sense like, oh, I love doing this because it's so meaningful. It was meaningful in the sense that without it, their lives were completely empty. Like there was just nothing there. It was Torah and mitzvot, which gives the Jewish life its meaning and structure entirely. And Rosenzweig cites the parable of Rabbi Akiva in the Gemara: just as a fish can't live outside of water, so too a Jew can't live apart from mitzvot. But it's not about being commanded. It's not about reasons and rationales. Torah and mitzvot are just part of who we are, and it's something that we can't escape. That was 2 sessions ago. Last session, we examined the debate between Rosenzweig and Martin Buber at the other end of the religious spectrum, right? If Hirsch is about you've got to keep all the mitzvot, they're from God, here's all the reasons why, Buber's at the opposite end. For Buber, God reveals God's self in Revelation. Right? Revelation happens for Buber, but God does not give law to human beings. Law is something that human beings create in response to God. But as a result, law, according to Buber, is always seen as being limited to a specific time and place. And because of that, Buber rejects the idea that we should submit to religious law today, because doing so would be a catastrophe. Buber says, if we knew every pasuk of the Torah and all the mitzvot came from God at Sinai, if we had certainty about this, then we could keep the mitzvot. Because we know God commanded, they're from Sinai, they're divine, we should keep them. But Buber's point is that that's not the case. We don't have that certainty, certainly not as modern Jews. And philosophically, he doesn't believe God is really a commander. Right? That God reveals, but God isn't a commander. And to submit to religious law that was developed thousands of years ago, Buber thinks actually prevents us from ultimately connecting to God. Because if one is to encounter God, one must do so through exercising their own freedom. If one is going to do a mitzvah, which isn't really a commandment for Buber, it's not because one is commanded, but rather because one feels that it is the proper response to God's revelation in the here and now. Rosenzweig, however, sees it quite differently from Buber. For Rosenzweig, revelation always means commandment, because to experience revelation is to experience God's love, and to be loved by someone is to feel drawn to them, to be compelled by them. The commandment at the heart of revelation, according to Rosenzweig, is then transformed by human beings into laws. But unlike Buber, that doesn't mean we should just get rid of mitzvot and halakha, because for Rosenzweig, it's only through halakha, only through the path of law, that one can recover the experience of commandment of mitzvah once again. There's no way to mitzvah, to that revelatory mitzvah, except through Jewish law. Now that all takes us to today's session, where I want to look at a fascinating letter of Rosenzweig to his friend Rudy Hallow. And this may be one of my favorite texts in all of Rosenzweig's writings. Rudy Hallow was a close friend of Rosenzweig. He's the son of Rosenzweig's mother's best friend. So he's like somebody he grew up with. He knew very well. Hallow's a few years younger than Rosenzweig, and he too is sort of finds himself in a similar dilemma to Rosenzweig, caught between a desire to be German. Hallow himself almost, or maybe even does baptize as Christian, but ultimately leaves that and wants to be Jewish. He eventually takes over for Rosenzweig as the head of the Lehrhaus when Rosenzweig is unable to continue to serve as director because of his illness. And the focus of this is a letter from 1922, is a dilemma that Hallow presents to Rosenzweig. And the dilemma is as follows, and in many ways it's, if you see yourself as a baal teshuvah at all, right? This is a dilemma that you'll understand. If you see yourself as a firm Jew at all, I think you'll understand this. And the dilemma is as follows: if one is committed to returning to Judaism, then one faces a fundamental question regarding halakha, regarding mitzvot. How can one take on a life of religious observance? How should one approach the mitzvot when you're starting from basically nothing, right? There's so many of them, 613 mitzvot, and obviously countless more rabbinic halachot. When you're starting off, you don't know how to do them. You don't know where to start. And you sort of even wonder, is it even possible to sort of take this all on? And these questions and more are what face the one who is attempting to return to the tradition, to become religious. The background to this letter appears to be that Hallow wants to know why Rosenzweig hasn't taken on all the mitzvot. But in 1913, when Rosenzweig almost converts to Christianity, right, and refuses not to, in the letter that we saw, this was several weeks ago, but in the letter that he writes to his cousin, Rudy Ehrenberg, he says, like, I am a Jew, I'm committed to being a Jew, but I don't know where exactly that's going to take me. And this is now 9 years later, and Rosenzweig is still not fully observant, right? He hasn't just jumped into taking on all the mitzvot. And even though he's written the Star of Redemption, even though he clearly wants to become religious and has become more religious, right? Hallow's sort of asking him, well, there's a bunch of us who find ourselves caught between our Germanness and our Jewishness, and we want to become more religious. If you, Rosenzweig, could sort of take it all on, you could serve as a model for us. You could show us like how to do this, and we need your help to be shown like how to take all of this on. I think it kind of bothers them that Rosenzweig is this like deep, profound religious thinker who's returning to the tradition, who has yet to, at least in their mind, fully embrace what we consider to be, Torah and mitzvot and halakha. So here's the letter, and Rosenzweig saying to Hallow, he says, "Do you believe it is so difficult to fulfill the commandments of the Torah?" Right, Hallow, you think this is such a big problem, right? Rosenzweig starts off the letter being a little bit blasé about this idea of taking on Torah and mitzvot and halakha. So he says, "No, you really think it's that hard to keep all the mitzvot, to keep halakha?" Rosenzweig says the opposite is true. Look at these people, right? He's talking about modern Orthodox Jews in Germany. He says, this is a very restrained Torah. And if it was my desire, I could begin to fulfill it already from yesterday morning. And because of this, I wouldn't become any more inflexible or coarse at all. Now, Rosenzweig is sort of saying to Hallow, you think it's such a big deal to become from. You think it's so hard to become from. And Rosenzweig's saying, well, if you really look at it closely, it's not so hard to be from. It's not as hard as you think. Look at all these people who are doing it. I and you, he's saying to Hallow, could do it too. It wouldn't even have to change us too much, right? We could still sort of be who we are. In a certain sense, like, again, is a life of Torah and mitzvot very hard? Of course. Is it easier when you've been raised that way, right? You just kind of know how to do it? Sure. But at the end of the day, keeping Torah and mitzvot means just like, as we see in any, number of modern Orthodox shuls, like it's not the world, right? You have to change your life, right? You got to keep kosher, you got to keep Shabbos, you got to, daven. But again, it's not impossible by any stretch of the means. And Rosenzweig is simply, acknowledging that maybe this isn't such a big problem as you think. But if that's the case, then we have to ask ourselves, why isn't Rosenzweig just taking it on? He's just sort of laid out how easy or potentially easily it could be. And Rosenzweig goes on to say, right, if I wanted to just jump in and keep all of Halakha, or attempt to keep all of Halakha, he says, in doing so, I would certainly remove from my life a problem. Like the central problem of my life after the conclusion of the Star of Redemption, the matter of Halakha. And so what Rosenzweig is saying here, he's saying attempting to take on mitzvot fully would in a sense make his life much, much easier, because the way that the Star of Redemption ends, it ends with the words into life, right? That he goes through this whole big philosophical, systematic work about thinking about what it means to be Jewish, what it means to be Christian, how these things are going to impact the world ultimately, and rethinking philosophy in the process. But in truth, the book ends by directing the reader back into life, right? It's not about escaping into ideas or into the heavens. It's about into the reality, the imminence of life, right? And that's the question for Rosenzweig. What does it mean to be a Jew in this world? What does it mean to be a Jew living a Jewish life? That's the ultimate question he's still struggling through, even after the Star is done, because he knows there's no singular answer to that question. So in a sense, just fully embracing Halakha, being like the rest of the Orthodox Jews, would make his life a lot easier. It would tell him, okay, here's what it means to be a Jew. Here's what your life is going to look like. But Rosenzweig doesn't want the determining factor for what Jewishness is supposed to look like to be decided by what the Orthodox community does. He thinks that would actually be, problematic in a way, and we'll unpack this as we go through. But in truth, this idea of being able just to jump into Halakha fully, jump into a life of mitzvot, it's true for a lot of Baalei Teshuvah that in a sense it makes their life easier. And in fact, many people become frum, they return to the tradition, less so because they have a true religious awakening, but because being frum solves problems for them. It provides them a clear way of life. And that makes life much easier, because now you have a clear way of life, you have a clear identity, a set of values, a community, right? It's all laid out for you. And for someone who finds themselves adrift in the world, like I said, it can make life much easier. There's something very appealing about that, just sort of jumping in and having everything sort of set out about how you're supposed to be. However, for Rosenzweig, these reasons are not sufficient. Faith isn't something you choose because it's rational or because it's convenient or because it sets up your life in a certain way that works for you. As we've said many times in these shiurim, for Rosenzweig, faith is something that you find yourself drawn towards. It's something inextricable. It's something that you just can't escape from. So for Rosenzweig, there can't be a simple answer to the question about what it means to be a Jew. And this attempt to just take on Halakha in its totality, right, would be like almost an easy way out. And he's really, struggling with that. Rosenzweig goes on, he says, do you not understand this? Imagine for yourself if I was to acquiesce to your demands and I would accept Halakha in the form that Samson Raphael Hirsch arranged it for the use of Western European Jews who have merited emancipation. What meaning would this have for you? Meaning, if I just became a modern Orthodox Jew, right, took it on just like the way they do it now in Germany, right, what good would that do you, Rudy Hallow, right? I would just be following what they're doing, and you would just be following me who's following what they're doing, right? What's the truly religious value in that? He continues, he says, forgive me that I responded to the midst of your heart, or to be more precise, from within your heart. You would certainly be more satisfied because you would be able to establish opposite the assumed everything, the nothing of your stated position. In our days, many act this way, but I reject now, just as I did before, the approach of everything or nothing. Right? That last line is really critical here. He's saying to Hallow, if you just want me to be like them so that you can be like me, that's not going to work. Right? That's not going to work for either of us. And the other alternative, which Rosenzweig is kind of aware of here, and this is more of like a psychological point, he's saying, I think, Rudy, you would appreciate it, or you want me to just jump into Halakha fully, because then you would be able to compare yourself to me. And you could look at me and say, wow, look at Franz, look how frum he is. That's not me, right? As much as Rudy Hallow says, like, I want to be religious, I want you to show me how, lead us the way. on a certain level, he also recognizes that Rudy is ambivalent, that Rudy doesn't really want to take this on. But if Franz takes it on, right, it enables Rudy to sort of like set himself up in opposition to him. And to be honest, that's what we do with identity all the time. We need people to compare ourselves against and say, I'm not like them. However, Rosenzweig isn't willing to embrace the everything of orthodoxy, and that bothers Hallow. He wants Rosenzweig to pick sides. Be reform Rosenzweig and be a little bit religious and maybe be creative like Buber is, but like reject the law, or take on Halakha and Torah and mitzvot fully, right? It really bothers Hallow that Rosenzweig isn't willing to ultimately pick a side here. But Rosenzweig understands that religious life cannot be black and white, because life always exceeds any kind of rigid categorization that we might try to create. And the attempt to divide life into black and white always fails, because this kind of binary, this kind of all or nothing approach cannot capture the way in which human existence overflows the attempt to create rules which claim to define things perfectly. And what Rosenzweig cannot stand is this assumption that life has to be everything or nothing, that halakha is everything or nothing, and that's the end of it, right? And it's really, really bothersome to him, but we know that's the way the world works today, right? You're a Democrat or you're a Republican, right? We think in terms of binaries, and we want to say, one side is the good guys, one side is the bad guys, and you have to pick. You don't get to somehow, choose a different path. And Rosenzweig recognizes, like hopefully most of us today recognize, that you can't just put people in one of two boxes and think that captures the full dimension of what it means to be a human being and what it means to be a Jew. So what I want to do is unpack a bit. When Rosenzweig says the everything or nothing approach, what sits behind these approaches? To a certain extent, the approach of everything is the approach of orthodoxy, and the approach of nothing is to a certain extent Buber's approach, or the approach of reform or liberal Judaism in general. And you'll see that, again, both of these approaches fail to capture fundamentally important truths about what it means to be a human being and what it means to be a Jew. So when we think about the approach of everything, or the problem of everything, right? On a certain level, we might say to yourselves, and I'm an Orthodox rabbi, right? If this is the approach of orthodoxy, what's so wrong with it? Right? If somebody comes to an Orthodox rabbi and asks whether they need to keep all the mitzvot, we all know what the answer is going to be, right? It's going to be yes, you have to keep all of them. And in fact, if we think about it in terms of conversion, in terms of gior, right, the convert gets asked whether they are willing to accept upon themselves all of the mitzvot, right? That's part of the conversion process. It's called Kabbalat mitzvot. It's considered by most to be an essential step of the conversion process. And in fact, the Gemara, at least in one place, says, if a convert, a potential convert, says, I will accept all the mitzvot except one, you're not supposed to take them in as a convert, right? So on a certain level, being Jewish means accepting all the mitzvot, right? This everything idea. So what could be so wrong about that? And we'll actually return to the conversion model in the next year, but I want to just put it out there in the moment that on a certain level, what Rosenzweig is saying here is a bit radical, right? How could halakha, how could the mitzvot really be anything other than everything? So the way Rosenzweig understands the problem of the everything, of like all of halakha, and you just got to do it all, he understands it is problematic for a few reasons. The first is that someone who is not religious, right? Remember, he's primarily thinking about baal teshuvah, not people who necessarily grew up from, but someone who is not religious, to take on all the mitzvot means taking on a whole way of life that is fundamentally, foreign to them. Rather than connecting one to the world, it will instead have the opposite effect of distancing one from the world, right? Because you sort of have a normal way of being in the world, and suddenly halakha and mitzvot come and completely take you, out of that and take you into a whole different world. Now, we might say that's where Torah and mitzvot get their holiness from, right? They are supposed to take you into a different world. But Rosenzweig, I think, correctly recognizes that maybe that's not such a good thing at the end. So in the letter to Rudy, he continues, he says, to accept the Shulchan Aruch would be a confirmation from the power of sacrificing life, right? To accept the Shulchan Aruch as defining the sum total of what it means to be a Jew, right? The Shulchan Aruch and all of its countless details, as if that's the only book that tells you what it means to be a Jew, right? If you're starting from a place of nothing, right, that's would be profoundly alienating to just say, okay, the Shulchan Aruch is going to decide now forever forward what your life looks like. And in a certain sense, to affirm the Shulchan Aruch, he's saying, means sacrificing life. It means turning to the book and all of its details over life. And as Rosenzweig goes on, he says to do that, he says in doing so, on the one hand, would be a monkish seclusion, and on the other hand, a foreign life that doesn't have real confirmation, meaning you're like not living in such a way that you feel connected to the world and to life, right? You're turning to the book, to the written word, and its attempt to provide details to define what your life is going to look like. He says, in this duality lives orthodoxy ever since the dismantlement of the last halachic mold, i.e. way of life, right? Ever since up until the emancipation, right? Jews had we saw this in one of the earlier shirim, right? The Torah and life were fundamentally intertwined, right? Each one organically was connected to the other. But after emancipation, after the Jewish world sort of fragments, where the synagogue and the home and halakha, instead of all being connected, all sort of fall apart, right? Suddenly, halakha and life don't go together so easily anymore. And I'll give you just another example of this. Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik, who's Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik's son, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, the great Rosh Yeshiva head of YU. His son is a history professor, very, very brilliant history professor, and he has a very important article called Rupture and Reconstruction. And the story he tells in this article is about the transformation of Orthodoxy in the 20th century as part of the process of modernization. And what he talks about is a lot of similarities to Rosenzweig, but one of the points that he makes is that before emancipation, modernity, before all the transformations in the 20th century, right, Jewish life is what he says was defined as a mimetic tradition. Right? Mimetic means to imitate. Right, so it was a tradition in which you learned how to be Jewish by watching your parents, right? By imitating your parents, by imitating others, right? Other people did certain things and you just followed along with them, right? Life was like language, right? We absorb language when we're young, when we're children. We absorb language without even really thinking about it, and we come to use language in a natural way. So too, that was what Jewish tradition was like. That's what Torah and mitzvot were like for Jews, right? You absorb it as a child when you're young, like a language. You learn it from watching others. You absorb it like organically, like almost through osmosis. It's not a conscious process. And just as you learn a language naturally, and you can speak it even creatively without thinking about it, that was the Jewish people's relationship to the tradition. However, after modernity, right, you lose that sort of natural tradition, that mimetic tradition of sort of naturally organically absorbing it from others, and instead it transitions, which the mimetic tradition is like life, right, deeply connected to life. Torah is embedded in life, to one in which it is a textual tradition, right? Tradition moves from being embedded into life into books, right? And Chaim Soloveitchik's point is that if you wanted to know how to be a Jew before modernity, it was look at your parents or ask your elders, or maybe talk to the rabbi if you need to, right? When you want to learn how to be a Jew after modernity, it's open a book, right? And you got to learn how to be a Jew from the details of what's written in a book. And as we all know, right, to learn something naturally through life versus to learn how to read it from a book are two very, very, very different experiences. And in truth, right, a book can never fundamentally overlay onto life in a way that is natural and makes sense. There's always a certain disconnect. I remember when I was young in school, I think it was like third or fourth grade, they asked us to write up the instructions that it takes to make a sandwich, right? And it wasn't just like a recipe. It was like all the instructions you could possibly think of if you wanted to tell somebody how to make a sandwich. So we might start right away and just say, well, you need 2 slices of bread and you need some peanut butter and you need some jelly, and you put the peanut butter on one side and jelly on the other, and you put the bread together, right? It sounds pretty simple. But the teacher immediately pointed out to us, well, wait a second, where would one get bread, right? Well, it'd be in the bag. Well, where did you get the bread in the bag, right? From the store. And how do you get the bread out of the bag? Well, you have to tear the bag, or you have to untie the bag. And Maybe you have to slice the bread. And no matter how many details, how many instructions you add, even for something as simple as making a sandwich, right, you're always going to leave stuff out, right? You're always going to, anytime you've tried to read an instruction manual, no matter how detailed it is, at some point you read it and you're like, wait a second, it's missing something. I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. And that's the shift that sort of takes place from tradition being natural and embedded in life to tradition being something that we learn out of books. And for Rosenzweig, that's a loss. For Chaim Soloveitchik, that's a loss. And for other thinkers, that's a loss. And I think there's something absolutely true to that. So it's not that Jews didn't keep the Shulchan Aruch before modernity, right? But when the Shulchan Aruch becomes the way in which you define Judaism in its totality, right, then you are fundamentally sacrificing something from life itself, and that's a big problem for Rosenzweig. So that's point number one, right? That the everything approach, right, it tends to turn away from life rather than towards life. But there's another even more serious problem with the approach that demands everything, and that's that if you are a German Jew or an American Jew who suddenly wants to return to the tradition, what do you do with your Germanness or your Americanness, right? If Halakha demands everything, then effectively you have to jettison those secular or non-Jewish parts of yourself. You got to get rid of them, which in a certain way would be a form of suicide, right? And if you have to cut off everything that makes you American or German or secular, right? Like you're basically just like killing yourself in a certain sense. And that's kind of what Rosenzweig says here. In a letter to Eugene Rosenstock, this is from a couple of years later after his letter to Hallow, but he picks up the same exact questions. And Rosenstock was the one who almost got Rosenzweig to convert to Christianity. Rosenstock is Christian, so he still maintains a relationship with Rosenstock, and he shares some of his writings with Rosenstock. And a later essay of Rosenzweig's called "The Builders," very important essay that was somewhat of a response to Buber. That essay is very much parallel to this letter to Hallow. And here's how he describes the essay to Rosenstock. He says, the problem of the builders, which is really the problem of the letter of Hallow, right? How does one keep halakha as a modern Jew? He says is a much narrower one. It's the problem of a generation or possibly a century. Meaning it's the problem of how are Jews who are not from return to the tradition again. And from Rosenzweig's perspective, that's not a permanent problem. That's like a problem of a generation, right? Once you return to the tradition, you maybe didn't grow up that way, but your children will then grow up as part of the tradition, and therefore it's not a problem for them as it was for you. That's what he's saying theoretically. We know it's actually much more complicated than that. But the problem is how Christian Jews, national Jews, which means like Zionists, religious Jews, which means Orthodox Jews, Jews from self-defense, meaning Jews that are really about like ethnic pride and things like that, Jews who are Jews from sentimentality or loyalty, in short, hyphenated Jews, such as the 19th century has produced, can once again, without danger to themselves or Judaism, become Jews. How can all these hyphenated Jews, all these hybrid Jews who are Jewish or Jewish only because of certain things, how do they become real Jews again? How do they become authentic Jews again? Thus, what is really under discussion here is the ability, while the imperative, metaphysical as well as biographical, is tacitly assumed, it is really addressed only to the hyphenated Jews who want to return. How does the German Jew, the American Jew, the modern Jew return to Judaism? How is that going to work? What's that process going to look like? What I tried to give in the Builders is a hygiene of return, right? He's basically trying to show how you can return to the tradition in a way that is healthy. Right? That's what he means by hygiene here. What it warns against is the somersault into the law. And by somersault into the law, Rosenzweig means this attempt to dive into the everything, right? Just to take it all on. It's all demanding of you all the time, and you're somersaulting into it. You leap into it, which is tempting because of the biographical crisis preceding it. Meaning, for a lot of Bali Tshuva, it's tempting to just jump into all of Torah mitzvot because there's usually some issue in their life that causes them to question everything and turn towards Judaism. And if you're having a crisis, right, there's nothing easier than, like I said before, to just kind of dive into a system that tells you exactly how you're supposed to live your life. Despite the existence of the great crisis, the individual should nevertheless wait for smaller events to actualize through their biographical energy the new I can. Right? For Rosenzweig, the return to the tradition is a process. I mean, it's very clear from his own life. I already said 9 years after his decision to stay Jewish, he is still not fully shomer mitzvot. He recognizes that this is something you have to take on step by step. He says, in this way, the person who returns maintains throughout the process of return his accustomed un-Jewish mode of life and is able to stay alive. Now, what's interesting here is that you might have thought Rosenzweig would say, well, it's a process because you can only sort of make this change, this transformation to being religious, to being frum, slowly, step by step, right? Mitzvah by mitzvah, one at a time, day after day, and eventually you get there. And over time, like you'll transform entirely, and you'll be a new person, and you'll let go of that non-Jewish, part of yourself, right? But it'll happen slowly over time, so you can tolerate it. But that's actually not what Rosenzweig says. What Rosenzweig says is, it's not just take it slow. He says, and you'll be transformed totally. He says, take it slow so that your non-Jewish self can be there every step of the way, right? And that's the only way for you to stay alive, if your non-Jewish self is part of you every step of the way. And I think this is very, fascinating and again, somewhat radical. Because for Rosenzweig to be a baal teshuvah, one has to be able to hold on to one's full self. And the attempt to separate the modern parts, the non-Jewish parts, would be incredibly damaging for oneself. Rosenzweig sees this in his own life, right? As much as he wants to return to the tradition, to embrace God, Torah, and mitzvot, he simply cannot reject his Germanness. It's part of who he is. He can no more easily get rid of it than he could cut off his own arm, right? And the attempt to take on all of the mitzvot, the everything, would mean cutting off his own arm. And we know this because Rosenzweig actually says this in a different letter from a year earlier. Again, this is another letter to Rudy Hallow, separate from the one we started with. He tells the story to Rudy how he was once at a Jewish school, or interviewing at a Jewish school as an adult, maybe to be a teacher. And he was asked whether or not, if Rosenzweig had to choose between his Germanness and his Jewishness, which would it be? Right? When the chips are down, what are you, a German or are you a Jew? And here's what Rosenzweig says. And as remember, this is very much like the all or everything or nothing question. Like Rosenzweig does not like these questions because he knows they can't capture the truth about what it means to be a human or what it means to be a Jew. And he says, I retorted that I refuse to answer this question. If life were at one stage to torment me and tear me into two pieces, then I would naturally know which one of the two halves, the heart, which is after all asymmetrically positioned, would side. Meaning if somehow life forced me to choose, he doesn't want to choose. He's not going to choose. But if somehow life forced him to choose, it would mean tearing him in half. And they would know whether he was really a Jew or German because the heart's only on one side. It's only on the left side, right? It's not on the right side. But in truth, other people might know where his heart really was, whether he was really a German or really whether he was really a Jew. But Rosenzweig says, I would also know that I would not be able to survive the operation. You want to tear me in half to determine whether I'm Jewish or German? You might find out what I am, but I won't. I won't survive. If the Orthodox approach demands everything, it is basically demanding the baal teshuvah to destroy themselves. And I hate to say this, but this sometimes happens. I've seen people become drawn to Torah and mitzvot, to frumkeit. I've seen them be taken in, I hate to say it, by like Haredi Kiruv or outreach, who emphasize that the person must give up every part of themselves that's secular or American or modern. And we're not just talking about like saying to people, you can't go to the movies anymore. But they'll say to people, you have to cut off all contact with your non-religious members of your family. And when you meet people who've gone through this transformation, where they make the somersault into the law, where they take on the everything, as Rosenzweig says, you've seen that they've undergone a great change and that they are no longer the same. Like there's a sense, and I hate to say this, where they're no longer whole. Like they've lost a piece of themselves in this process that was essential to who they are. You don't see the same person anymore. Those things that made them unique, singular, are suddenly snuffed out, often under a black hat and a black suit. And this is the problem of the everything. At its worst, it makes you sacrifice that which makes you what you really are, right? Because your Americanness, your Germanness, your modernness, your secularness, it's part of who you are. And giving that up means again, destroying who you are. And you cannot be a Jew if it means destroying who you are. Because as I said before, right, on some level for Rosenzweig, a very, very fundamental level, right, the test of what it means to be Jewish, the test of what it means to be religious, it is a test which manifests in life, right? The ability to live your life and to live it fully is what's going to grant, authenticity to your way of life. And if your way of life means fundamentally compromising who you are as a singular person, and singularity is very important for Rosenzweig, right? Everybody is unique and everybody expressed their uniqueness differently in contradiction and complexity and all sorts of things. But if becoming religious means losing that singularity, there's a real problem, a real big problem. That's the problem of everything. But as I said before, there's the other end of the spectrum, and that's the problem of nothing, right? Like just simply saying, I'm not going to do any of this if it's too much, right? If I can't do it all, I'm going to do nothing, right? Or I'm only going to do it on my terms, which in a certain sense is like the approach of nothing. And this is a different temptation, but it's no less problematic than the problem of the everything. If those who embrace everything make too great a sacrifice, then those who embrace nothing are unwilling to make any sacrifice at all. Rosenzweig notes that his attempt to chart a middle path here between orthodoxy and reform is not the first time this has been attempted, right? And that's part of the problem of the approach of nothing. He says, we, all those that don't proclaim everything or nothing, everybody's trying to get out of this binary and chart a middle path of some kind. Begin today to walk again in the path of liberalism from a century ago that failed. Meaning, here we are, there's a small group of us German Jews who want to find a path that's not orthodox in the negative sense, nor reform. But when this was tried in the 19th century, either by reform or by Zachariah Frankel and positive historical Judaism, which was sort of a forerunner to the conservative movement, those approaches didn't work. And we have to understand why they didn't work. He says it failed because it tried first to establish principles and only afterwards to act according to them. Right? Reform and conservative movement in the 19th century said, we're not going to accept the Torah simply because it's tradition. It said, no, we know better. We are going to look at the time and look at the culture and look at our values as Germans, and we'll be able to determine what Judaism should be. Right? We'll be able to determine the principles that undergird what Judaism is supposed to be. Right? They're going to determine what mitzvot, what rituals should be kept based on the extent to which they conform with the values and principles that they thought were most appropriate for the times. And if mitzvot or halakha didn't measure up, then there was no reason to hold on to it. Now, the problem with this approach is, I think, kind of obvious to us if we look at today and sort of see the tremendous weaknesses of non-Orthodox Judaism. The problem with this approach is that we as human beings don't really get to determine the course of Judaism simply by looking at what principles or values mean most to us, or we think are the most important or the most essential, and shaping Judaism to match it. Right. So again, like you can look at it as if, and Rosenzweig doesn't say it this way, but I think it's accurate, right? Instead of like looking at the Torah and trying to see how the Torah can be part of life, right? The approach of nothing does the opposite. It looks at life and then cuts the Torah to make it fit life, right? Which means that it's an approach that doesn't really see sacrifice at all, right? If orthodoxy sacrifices too much, it's making you cut off your arm or cut off half your body to be part of it. Right. The problem of nothing is saying, don't worry, you can be a Jew and not lose and be totally a German. Right. There's no, you can be a good German. You can be the best German. Right. And still be a Jew. It's not going to cost you anything. We can show you how it all fits together perfectly. Right. All the liberal humanistic values of German culture can be manifest in Judaism. And you never have to be uncomfortable with your Jewishness. Right. If suddenly you discover that, you can historically critique Judaism, well, don't worry, we'll get rid of the stuff that we don't like. Or, if you can critique Judaism from the perspective of its text or, philosophically, right, you can just reshape Judaism to be what you want and get rid of the parts that you don't like. And in many ways, this approach is something of like of a narcissistic one. And it really can't give religious life meaning, at least the kind of meaning that compels us to be drawn towards religious life, towards Torah and mitzvot and God, and ultimately sacrifice for it. Because in truth, right, if there's no sacrifice at the heart of it, right, there's nothing real there for you, right? For something to be real for you, for something to mean something for you, right, you have to be willing to sacrifice for it, right? You have to be willing to give of yourself. You have to be willing to let it like dominate and give meaning to your life, right? That your whole life suddenly has to be shaped around it rather than you shaping it around your life. If Judaism is meant to be an encounter with God, how can that be possible if human beings set the parameters of what that is to look like? If human beings set up, look at the Torah, okay, we've got the principles, we're going to now determine what Judaism looks like. And Rosenzweig goes on, he says, these principles remained, similar to those who preach them, as officers without soldiers or fathers without children. Meaning, Reform, Conservative, they came up with these like principles, these grand ideas about what Jewish life should look like based on, their own thinking and the culture and all of that. But there was nobody to follow it, right? There was nobody to care. It was officers without soldiers, fathers without children, which is that last line, fathers without children, is again emphasizing how this approach tends towards assimilation. We, however, begin with actions. The principles, it is possible we will discover, or others afterwards. Meaning, we might find out there's a deeper meaning, and we'll be able to orient our, halachic way of life accordingly. But first and foremost, it begins with doing. It begins with the doing, because that's what Judaism is, right? What does halakha mean? Halakha means to go. It's a way of being. It's a doing. It's not principles. It's not going to shul 3 times a year and that's it, right? It is an all-encompassing doing, a way of being. And if one wants to set the course of Judaism, it's going to be through actions. And actions always mean making sacrifices, because actions are hard, right? But it's our actions that often reflect our beliefs far more than the beliefs that we, that come out of our mouths. Right? And this is a very fundamental point, right? We say we believe all certain things and all sorts of things are important to us. But in truth, if you really want to know what matters most to people, you have to look at what they do, right? You have to look at how they live their lives. You have to look at what are they willing to sacrifice for? What are they dedicating their time to? That says far more about their beliefs than the things that they say. Because we all know, human beings are hypocrites. We all say certain things, but often do other things. And Rosenzweig is saying you got to look at your actions, right? That's what really, really counts at the end of the day. He has this great line here. It's from a different letter. I didn't put it in the slide, but I'll just read it. This is to a different friend of his. He says, only if a person does something does the true difficulty begin. Only when you start doing, and you start doing, meaning you're not just setting the parameters fully ahead of time, but you're out there taking risks and doing, that's where you're finally alive in the world. Before then, in writing, one can bathe, comb, and make everything pretty until it is wonderful. When you're writing an article, when you're writing okay, this is what Judaism is, right? You can make it as pretty as you want. But when the actions begin to run around us and they appear unbathed and uncombed, and worse than this, so bent and twisted, do not forget that they are our actions, our beloved children. Meaning words you can make them mean whatever you want, but they don't mean a whole lot at the end of the day. What matters is our actions, and our actions are often not so pretty, right? When you try to live your life according to certain ideals, when you really start taking serious action towards those ideals, you'll often see very quickly that those actions don't live up to what you want to, right? They're unbathed when you're really out there trying to do, right? Again, we can use a simple parallel, and I often pick on Murray, right? It's the difference between, sitting in a classroom in med school and being in the emergency room, right? It's the actions, it's that experience, it's being there with your hands, elbow deep into somebody's body trying to save their life that is real, and it's messy, and it's difficult, and it's complicated. What you learn in that, medical lecture back in medical school is, as disconnected from life as possible, right? You learn how to be a doctor, not in the classroom, but, in the hospital, as real as those actions can ultimately be. When religious life is turned into pretty words, those words become disconnected from reality. That's what's happened for Reform and the conservative movement to a large extent. They don't compel us. Rather, we utter them to make ourselves feel good about ourselves. The real challenge is doing something concrete, and that's what halakha and mitzvot represent. It's a way of doing and being in the world, and that's always messy, inevitably. It always comes with costs. And as we unfortunately know all too often, to act in this world often means falling short of our ideals and making sacrifices and being compromised in ways that we don't like. But that's what determines things. That's what it means to really be in the midst of life, and to be connected to life. And that always means making sacrifices, right? Like to be in the world, to be in relationship, right? To be trying to sustain a certain way of life means making sacrifices for it. And the approach of nothing wants to have its cake and eat its too. Wants to be a Jew, to be able to kind of determine what the course of that looks like without having to make real sacrifices, without having to really, be overly disturbed by it or take real risks. And for Rosenzweig, that's simply not acceptable. Now, I'll continue. He then leaves us then wanting to know, well, what's the alternative, right? There's the problem of everything, which says, again, make sacrifices that will destroy you, essentially. Disconnect yourself from life in a way that means you become sort of like just a zombie, right? Like just doing what everybody else is doing mindlessly, religiously. That's the problem of everything, or the problem of nothing, which basically says you can have Judaism on your own terms. You don't have to make any sacrifices. You can make it look however you want, but that can't ultimately be compelling as a fundamental way of life, because it's narcissistic at the end of the day. It's just doing whatever reinforces how you feel about yourself, makes you feel good. So between those approaches, Rosenzweig says that we have to find the something, right? He says our inheritance is not everything and not nothing, but rather something. The something, or the mashu in Hebrew, is what is given to us. And with something, it is upon us to form ourselves. So we don't do everything and we don't do nothing, right? Neither of those are ultimately the Jewish path that he sees we need to follow. We have to find the something. So what is this something, right? Because it's very, very important for Rosenzweig. We'll have to see, but at the very least, as I said, it's not everything and it's not nothing. It is neither all of the mitzvot, all of Halakha, feeling compelled to just take it all on. And if you're not doing it, you're a sinner. And it's not nothing. It doesn't mean not doing any of it or only doing the parts you like. It's something in between. Now, this might sound strange or too unorthodox that Rosenzweig could advocate such an approach, but I want to point out the obvious, which is that none of us do all the mitzvot, right? Even the most religious, even the most frum rabbi in the world regularly falls short in the performance of mitzvot, right? They may be extremely machmir about tefillah or kashrut or studying Torah, but I guarantee you there are many mitzvot, many halachot that they fail at, that they maybe don't remember at a certain moment, or they forget, or they're not able to do properly, right? So in a certain sense, this idea of the everything is a bit of like a fantasy, right? Like it's something that we sort of say to ourselves, like, I'm going to be the frum Jew. I'm going to be, doing the right way, and I can feel good about myself that I'm living the way life is supposed to be, and I can look down at those who aren't, keeping halakha and just say, they're not doing it right. I'm the one doing it right. But the everything is really a fantasy, and to a certain extent, a delusion in a certain way, right? So there is no real everything, even though there are plenty of people who think that's what they're doing or demand that that's what everybody should be doing. And Rosenzweig goes on. He says, I don't come to claim that my something is appropriate to use as a model for others. But there is something about it that can serve as a model against the idealists of nothing and against those of everything. And that I've gathered the courage to live my something. In its details, it cannot serve as an example, but in the details, it can't. But to be able to live my something as my something, he feels is incredibly important for himself and perhaps can serve as a model for others. Not because he keeps kashrut in a certain way or keeps Shabbos in a certain way, but rather because he is showing people what it means to live your Judaism in this, with this deep existential commitment, and not just a ideological commitment because that's what other people want you to do or because it makes you feel good. So Rosenzweig is not trying to claim that he knows the proper path to return to tradition, to God, to Torah, to mitzvot. His way cannot serve it as an example. He's not trying to set up a new denomination. I mean, that's the whole point of this essay, which is exactly what usually happens. a charismatic religious leader trailblazes a new path about what it means to be Jewish, and all of a sudden you have synagogues and Jewish organizations sprouting up around them like mushrooms after the rain, all suddenly like affiliating with this new denominational identity. Rosenzweig has no interest in this. While his religious life is not meant to serve as a model about how to specifically be Jewish in the concrete details, it does serve as a model in another important way. It shows that one does not need to be part of a denomination to be Jewish, right? That's not the way one should be thinking about things. One can, in fact, be Jewish without being Reform or Orthodox, for Rosenzweig. And the reason for this is really important, because Rosenzweig understands that religious life is so often about conformity, or so often just about making us feel good about ourselves. It's about acting in a certain way because it conveys your identity to others, and it allows for that identity to be recognized by others. Again, you take on a certain denominational identity. I'm a Reformed Jew, I'm a conservative Jew, I'm an Orthodox Jew. You go to the shul, and the certain shul, and you're doing what everybody else does, and everybody else recognizes you because that's who you are. And we kind of need that in life. But again, it's fundamentally a distraction from what it means to be living authentically Jewish, with an authentic relationship to God, Torah, mitzvot, and even our fellow Jews, right? Most of what we do in life, and we know this, is because we want to be accepted and recognized by others. It's profoundly difficult, if not nearly impossible, for most of us to chart a path outside of the reigning ideologies. And what Rosenzweig is saying is he's hoping that at the very least he can show people that. I can't show you how to be a Jew, but I can show you how to not be a Reform, conservative, or Orthodox Jew. And that is important, because unless you can show people that's possible, you can't begin to show them what an authentic relationship to God, Torah, and in mitzvot is fundamentally about. One can defy convention for Rosenzweig. One can be their own person and choose to be religious, not because that's what the rabbis say or because that's what will get you accepted into a particular community, but because something inside of you demands such a thing, because you hear God calling to you, as Rosenzweig says. Rosenzweig continues, he says, "Behold, I'm only at the beginning of the way. What will come from this I do not know, and I do not want to know. I hope and even know that others will begin to think like me, and in the end, from all these beginnings, will emerge something that can be a model," right? He's hoping that this can be the beginning of something more, of people returning to the tradition authentically, and that those people can be a living force within Judaism, and not just continue to fall within these ideological boundaries that are ultimately bad for them and bad for Judaism as well. He says, from where, and this is really the big question for him, this last part here, from where do I have the permission to begin while lacking a principle and approach? Meaning, what gives me the right, I, Franz Rosenzweig, to the approach of something, right? And as opposed to the approach of everything or nothing. He says, this is an earlier theoretical question that I'm obligated, to, of course, to answer. However, I answered it in the Star of Redemption. Judaism isn't halakha. It creates halakha, but it's not identical with it. Judaism's identity is to be a Jew. Now, we have to understand what Rosenzweig is saying here. On the one hand, it sounds radical once again, right? That but again, it's also true. Judaism is a way of life that cannot be reduced to halakha. Judaism is more than halakha. That's what Rosenzweig is saying here. If Judaism was only halakha, we would just study the Shulchan Aruch and that would be it, right? If Judaism was only halakha, we would get up on Shabbat morning and we would have public readings from the Shulchan Aruch instead of the Torah. There would be no need for most of the Torah, all the stories, all the narratives of the Torah, or Midrash, or Agadah, right? Like there's so much of Torah, of Judaism that cannot be reduced to halakha, no matter what we want. Now, I do want to clarify, for Rosenzweig, Judaism can't be reduced to halakha, but at the same time, Judaism cannot exist in any kind of ongoing fashion without halakha, right? So Judaism can't be reduced to halakha, but there is no Judaism without halakha. So in that sense, Jewish law is essential. It provides a structure that gives Jewish life its shape. As Rosenzweig said in the letter that we read after his choice not to convert to Christianity, a Jew is defined by the one who keeps returning to the tradition. To hear God's call and to return is to hear God's commanding voice. which, as we have said, is it can only be fully heard through the practice of halakha. And Rosenzweig says, this is how I've explained it in the start. I know this is correct, but now understand that after the conclusion of the book, see the last word in it. The last word of the Star of Redemption is life. Begins the confirmation from the power of life that comes after theory. Please place the emphasis on life, the confirmation from the power of life. Right? The Star of Redemption ends by entering into life, because the truth of Torah, the truth of God, and the truth of what it means to be a Jew are not going to be ultimately found in a book, at least not solely in a book. It's going to have to be found in life. And that's what's going to determine the shape of halakha. It's not the rabbis, it's not even the poskim, halachic authorities, it's Jewish life itself. And when you look at Jewish history, you see this, right? There's a famous Talmudic story about Hillel. It's the story that explains Hillel's rise to power as an influential rabbi. Hillel comes from Babylonia to Israel during the Second Temple. And it happens that Erev Pesach is on Shabbat, right? The day before Pesach is on Shabbat. And you have to get the Korban Pesach ready on the day before Pesach, which means on Shabbat. So all the Jews have to bring their goats and lambs up to Har Habayit, up to the Temple Mount on Shabbat with the Pesach sacrifice. And it's not clear whether they can do this, because it would theoretically also mean carrying, either carrying the animal or carrying the animal with the knife that's going to be used to slaughter the animal, and you can't carry on Shabbat. So, like, what do we do? And the rabbis during the Second Temple weren't sure what to do. And Hillel, basically he gives halachic reasoning for it on a certain level, but he also says, you know what? Let's watch and see what the people do. He says, "Inam nevi'im b'nei nevi'im hen." Right? They may not be prophets, the Jewish people collectively, but they are the descendants of prophets. And what he sees is, what the rabbis see is that people bring their animal to the temple, and the animal carries the knife, or again, there's a whole debate about exactly how it works. But the point is the Jewish people decide at the end of the day. And that's kind of Rosenzweig's point here. Halakha, as much as the rabbis determine it through interpreting the Torah, there's a dimension of it that exceeds the rabbis and teshuvot and all of that, and the Shulchan Aruch, and ultimately rests with the Jewish people. And that only gains its authority from the experience of life itself. And Rosenzweig goes on, he says, look at the article of Eugene Mayer in the tribute book honoring Rabbi Nobel. The last ancient rule that was established according to the verse, and this is now his own drasha. He's making a drasha on a verse that's based on a rabbinic interpretation about why is it that we can start from the place of something rather than everything or nothing. It's, you shall keep my laws and my rules, by the pursuit of which men shall live. I am the Lord your God. And the key verse, part of the verse here, is v'chai behem. The God says you should live through the mitzvot. One must live through them and not die in them. And I'll explain what that means, but that's the drasha, right? That's what he grants him. He feels the authority to take the approach that he does. This rule is obligatory today. If it is even to be considered a rule over and above our fulfillment of the commandments, what one is able to do, another is not able to do. That which is freedom for one is coercion for another. So that last line we're going to come back to, but for our purposes, v'chai behem, right? That you should live in the mitzvot. So the context for this in the Gemara, in Masechet Sanhedrin, is that the rabbis are debating under what circumstances you have to die for Torah, for mitzvah, for God. And the rabbis basically come to the conclusion that one is actually supposed to live and transgress the mitzvot rather than die for at least most of the mitzvot. All right, they make an exceptions, the big three, the three cardinal sins: idolatry, murder, and sexual licentiousness. Those sins you have to die rather than transgress. But everything else, you choose life, right? You choose life rather than die for Torah, at least for the overwhelming majority of it. And for our purposes, well, what is this? How does this justify Rosenzweig's approach? The way I just explained it is the traditional rabbinic interpretation. So one way to understand the way that Rosenzweig is applying it here is that one can only do what one can, right? You just can only do the mitzvot that you can do, right? And if you reach a point where doing mitzvot is going to threaten your, existence, where it becomes too much, right? Like, one has to prioritize life, right? And if something is too much, one shouldn't do it, right? If things are going to be too hard, too hard, right? You just that's as far as you ultimately go. That's, I say, like maybe the more superficial way of approaching this, right? We can't take on all the mitzvot because it's too much. We're gonna like die if we do all the mitzvot. That's why we just do what we can, right? And again, Torah is about life. We need to preserve life. Don't do anything that's too much. Don't do anything that's dangerous. Any of that. And for the baal teshuvah, this means that if one cannot do a mitzvah or give up their non-Jewish side, then again, one is exempt, right? One can be exempted out of the rest of the mitzvah. That's I said the superficial way of looking at this, but there is a deeper way of looking at this, which we are not going to have time to do fully, but I just want to do very briefly. So Rosenzweig, in a discussion in his essay, "The Builders," talks about again the same question about how do we return to the tradition, to halakha, right? When you're starting from nothing. And he says we return to halakha in the same way that we return to Torah. And he says when it comes to Torah, we have to study it. We have to study all of it. And we don't know from the time that we begin studying what parts of it are going to come alive for us, and ultimately that we're going to experience as commanding to us, as hearing God's voice in it, and as demanding, of us, that we have to live our life according to it. Right? At a certain level, you could just say, well, I'm just, if the rabbi says this is Torah, that's what I got to listen to. That's it. But Rosenzweig, like with mitzvot, thinks that the study of Torah has to be a process as well, and that we have to go through all of it. And even the parts that maybe other generations kind of left behind, we have to find the pieces of it. We have to go through all of it, because any of it might be that which speaks to us. And he says at a certain point, you reach a moment where you're following your path all the way through the Torah, and at a certain point you reach a moment where you kind of have to step beyond that. Not beyond the Torah as Torah, but you have to step beyond it in the sense that you have to be able to hear, God's voice within it. And what that means, and he has a very powerful line here. He says that he says, what's the advantage of going through all of Torah to find out what parts of it are really Torah for you? He says a very small advantage, which most people do not consider worth so much the trouble, but which we believe justifies the utmost trouble. For only this laborious and aimless detour through knowable Judaism, only that going through all of it, gives us the certainty that the ultimate leap from that which we know to that which we need to know at any price, the leap to the teachings leads to Jewish teaching. So you have to go through Torah to find Torah, right? You're not going to find Torah outside of Torah. You got to go through Torah to find Torah. And at some point you make that leap where you just hear God's voice within it. But the key line here is that leap involves that sense of when you find Torah is that you find that which you need to know at any price, right? Essentially, when you discover your mashu, your something, when you discover that piece of Torah that is your Torah, you discover that which you need to know at any price, that which you cannot live without. And that, to me, is the real fundamental definition. When Rosenzweig says you must live through the mitzvot, he's not saying, well, you got to live religious life in such a way that it doesn't kill you. What he's really saying is that you have to find those mitzvot that you cannot live without. That's what it means to b'chai b'hem, to live in the mitzvot. It means to have the mitzvot be so central to your life that you can't live without them. Maybe it won't be all of them, but there has to be at least some of them that fit that description. I'll just take us back again to Rabbi Akiva's piece here, which I mentioned last time. Rosenzweig again says this in The Builders. Even if one would wish to do everything possible, to do all the mitzvot, the everything, right? If you're going to try to dive into all that, even if somehow you were doing it performatively, externally, behaviorally, he would still not fulfill the law. He would not fulfill it in a way by which law would become commandment. If you want to jump into everything, you are actually precluding the possibility of experiencing true mitzvah, of hearing God's voice within that halakha, within that mitzvah. A commandment which he must fulfill simply because he cannot allow it to remain unfulfilled. Right? That's what it means. You can't live without it. Right? That's what it means to live through the mitzvot. It doesn't mean only do the ones you can do, or the easy ones, or the relevant ones, or the ethical ones, or the ones that make you feel good. It means you have to have, as the core of your Judaism, mitzvot that you just can't live without. And again, this is the story of Rabbi Akiva and the parable of the fishes. According to Rabbi Akiva, Torah and mitzvot for a Jew is like water for a fish. When the fox sees the fish in the water swimming away from the nets of the fishermen, the fox offers the fish to come on out of the water and ride on his back, and he'll take care of them. The fish, of course, respond, they can't do that. While they may die when facing the fishermen's nets, they will certainly die if they leave the water they are swimming in to hop on with the fox. And if you're a Jew, water is the Torah and mitzvot. You cannot live without, even if it means risking your life. You have to stick with it, right? There have to be mitzvot that you're willing to die for, and there have to be mitzvot which you're willing to live for, which without which you couldn't live for, because it is exactly those things which grant meaning to one's life, and without them, all one really has is death, right? That's the mashu, that's the something, that's the v'chai behem, right? Those are those mitzvot that you feel compelled by and commanded by. But it means that is your metric for your engagement with Torah and with God, and not just the taking on of the everything. What is the something of Torah and mitzvot that is to serve as the foundation for the baal teshuvah? It's those things that one is drawn to, compelled by, that give one's life its religious meaning, and that one cannot live without them. If one's religious life is built on conformity, it means sacrificing who you really are. If one's religious life is built on determining ahead of time what one will do and won't do, so that can conform to a certain set of principles or ethical ideals, then there's no possibility of a genuine encounter with God. You're closing God out by setting the boundaries ahead of time as to what religious life can look like. Both the approach of everything and the approach of nothing are often flimsy. They tend to collapse when they meet real challenges. Instead, meaning the one who says everything, suddenly when they're faced with a real challenge, maybe isn't so bothered by like letting some mitzvot go. And the one who says nothing, suddenly under the right circumstances, they're as firm as any Orthodox Jew as you'll find, right? Because again, it's not about some deep commitment that they can't escape. It's about, to a certain extent, convenience and a certain sense of recognition and all of that. We rarely ask ourselves, what are we willing to die for? Though for Rosenzweig, this is a very important question. However, what's an even more important question, and it's at the heart of this letter, and we all have to ask ourselves this, is what are we willing to live for? What about Torah and mitzvot are we willing to live for, such that without it, we can't go on? Personally, I know that not every mitzvah I do remotely fits this description. I do a lot of things simply because I know that's what a good Orthodox Jew should do, and that's what the Shulchan Aruch says. But I don't have in my Torah and mitzvot that fit into the category of Rosenzweig something. If I don't have those things that are the something, then I don't really have a religious life at all. And we'll talk more about this next time. How do we know what's the something? How do we know what mitzvot fit into that? And what about the mitzvot we're not doing? We can't just ignore them, right? Then we'd be back in the approach of nothing, right? Even the things I'm not doing, I have to kind of hear their call in some way or another. But in truth, we have to find those things we can't live without. We often don't know this, especially if you grew up religious. You don't know this until they're not there, right? For me, I mean, I'll just be very clear. During the beginning of the pandemic, when life sort of felt like it was collapsing all around us, the thing I knew that I couldn't live without was Torah, right? Like the studying Torah and teaching Torah. Like that was a mitzvah I just couldn't live without. And I didn't fully, I love Torah. I teach Torah, I study Torah, I write about Torah. So you'd think it should be obvious to me. That's my something, that's my v'chai behem. But I didn't really fully realize how profoundly important it was to me until everything else was like almost taken away. And then I realized, wow, right? Like this is what grants my life meaning in ways I hadn't even fully appreciated. I think on some level, this is what I'm willing to die for. But like I said, what was even more clear to me is that this is what I live for, right? And that's where we have to mark our path of returning back to halakha and Torah and mitzvot.